Greetings, Torah scholars. If we ask God every day in our prayers to return to the temple and to return to the service of the temple, why don't we actively do it? If we ask God to return to the service of the korbanot, the sacrifices, avodat ha-korbanot, why don't we bring sacrifices today? And perhaps this tied to a more central question, which is the kedusha, the sanctification of Temple Mount and of the temple remains even after the destruction of the temple? To answer this and discussing this topic, we will do this today here at Advanced Judaism for Beginners. My name is Ashi. Welcome back to the channel. So we're in the middle of discussing the Zionist position on settling the land of Eretz Israel. And in the last video, we started to discuss Chovevei Tzion, which was a movement in the 18th century. And specifically, we spoke of a giant of a figure named Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, who is one of the leaders, the Orthodox religious leaders of Chovevei Tzion. And he writes a book called Drishat Tzion, which one of the central arguments that he makes in that book, Halachic arguments, is that we should return to Avodat HaKorbanot, to the service of the sacrifices in Jerusalem, even if the temple is not built. So in today's video, we're going to explore that idea. And I would like to begin with Maimonides, with an idea coming from the Rambam in Mishneh Torah, which is, in Mishneh Torah, Maimonides explains the kedusha of the Temple Mount, of the temple courtyard, and of Jerusalem, and of the land of Israel. And the status of each kedusha brings a certain halachic ramifications. So, when we're discussing the kedusha, the sanctification of Temple Mount and of the temple courtyard, there were very specific things that were supposed to be performed in those areas and only in that area. So there were certain sacrifices that can only be eaten in the courtyard of the temple. There were other sacrifices that were permitted to be eaten anywhere in the city of Jerusalem. So when we speak about certain area and we speak about the kedusha of it, the sanctification of it, it brings a certain halachic impact, ramifications. Also, by the way, when we're speaking about the land of Israel as a whole, the kedusha of the land of Israel as a whole, then we're also speaking of a certain halachic consequences. So when we come to the land of Israel as a whole, we speak about the agricultural laws, the tithe, the masrot, and the trumot, and we spoke about the shvi'it, the sabbatical. So again, when we're speaking about a certain area, temple, Jerusalem, the land of Israel, and we're speaking about the sanctification of it, then it has a certain halachic ramification. The Rambam explains, to determine the area of a certain sanctification, of a certain kedusha, that can only be determined by the Sanhedrin. That's the supreme, you could call it the Supreme Court or supreme body of sages and judges that dwelled in the temple. And you needed the king, and you needed the high priest with his Urim Vetumim specifically. When he had the oracle, the spiritual oracle that was placed in his breastplate. By the way, Urim Vetumim literally means, Urim means shining, Tumim means precise. And that again is referring to the spiritual oracle that was placed inside the breastplate, which was one of the garments of the high priest. So again, Maimonides writes that in order to determine, to sanctify, I should say, to sanctify a certain area, either to determine that it's part of the temple or the temple courtyard, or to determine it's part of Jerusalem, or to expand the sanctified area of Jerusalem, that again, Maimonides rules, and this is based on previous halachic rulings. Maimonides writes that you need for that, again, the Sanhedrin, the king, and the high priest with his Urim Vetumim. And Maimonides continues and explains how, and describes how indeed King Solomon, by the first temple, and Ezra, who is the Ezra the scribe, the Jewish leader in the second temple, how they both sanctified the temples of their time, and each one brought certain sacrifices, was a whole ceremony to make it the kedusha of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, Maimonides writes that even though by Ezra time, they did not have the Urim Vetumim, there was no spiritual oracle of the high priest at the time, and there was no king. So Maimonides explains that really the sanctification that Ezra did was more symbolic. And really the sanctification that King Solomon did about 500 years earlier, that was a sanctification, and that one became everlasting. So when Ezra led the Jews and rebuilt the second temple, it was really on the validity of the sanctification that King Solomon did by the first temple. And based on that, they were able to bring the sacrifices during the second temple at Temple Mount. So again, in order to bring sacrifices, you need to have a certain kedusha of the Shekhinah, a certain holiness, sanctification of the divine province that is there. And that was established during King Solomon time. And based on that, Ezra at the second temple again returned to the service of the sacrifices and rebuilt the second temple. Now, Maimonides concludes and he says, based on that, the kedusha, the sanctification that King Solomon did is everlasting one. And Maimonides writes that therefore one can bring sacrifices on Temple Mount in the place, in the space where the altar was, even after the destruction of the temple. Why? Because again, the sanctification of King Solomon was everlasting one. And that did not change due to the destruction of the temple. Now let's read this part of Maimonides inside. Therefore, we may offer all the sacrifices on the temple site, even though the temple itself is not built. Similarly, sacrifices of the most holy order can be eaten in the entire area of the courtyard, of the temple courtyard, even though it is in ruin and not surrounded by the divider. That was a certain divider, the mechitza, that divided between the temple courtyard and the temple. We may also eat sacrifices of lesser sanctity and Maser Sheni throughout Jerusalem. So again, this is a certain halacha that existed in the Kedusha of Jerusalem. So the Maser Sheni was a tithe that was given, was being rotated between that and Maser Ani. Again, once maybe we'll discuss the sabbatical cycle and the various tithes associated with it. But one of them was Maser Sheni, was a second tithe that each Jewish farmer in the land of Israel was supposed to bring that tithe to Jerusalem and to eat it there in Jerusalem. It says, B'kedusha v'tahara, with holiness and purity. So again, it was an obligation that the owner himself of the crops was supposed to eat a second tithe in Jerusalem specifically. So Maimonides here explains, again, back to Maimonides, Maser Sheni throughout Jerusalem, even though it is not surrounded by a wall, for through its original consecration, it was consecrated for the time and for eternity. So So again, this is a very fascinating point of the Rambam. Now, very interesting is that the Rambam later explains that the sanctity that exists in the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, it's based on the sanctity of King Solomon. Now he says, very interesting, that the sanctity of the land of Israel that existed, the validity of it is based on the conquest that the Jews were commanded to conquer and wage wars to conquer the land of Israel. So that sanctity is based on that, the validity of it. So based on this, in our discussion, the Rambam rules that the sanctity is everlasting. Now, the Raavad, who is Rabbi Avram ben David, he was a rabbi in province France, and he was a Bala Sagot. You can translate as a critic of the Rambam. Very often he disagrees with them. Here, actually, the Raavad disagrees with the Rambam, and he holds Kedusha, that the holiness in Temple Mount, it's not everlasting, and after that destruction, it was expired. Now, of course, according to everyone, including to the Raavad, we pray and yearn for the Messianic days when we will return to the Temple Mount and return back the holiness and the Kedusha and can return to the full service of the temple. But again, the Raavad holds that the validity of the Kedusha to bring the korbanot, to bring the sacrifices after the destruction, does not remain in the holy temple, and the Shekhinah, the divine province, went away from it, so to speak, in what's it called. So again, we have two opinions here. We have the opinions of Maimonides and then the opinion of the Raavad. In our discussion, it looks like Maimonides will hold that you can bring sacrifices today even without the temple. Raavad will disagree. Now, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, a gay from Chovevei Tzion, he actually makes the argument that according to both, you will be able today to bring the sacrifices at the Holy Temple. Why? According to Maimonides, it's obvious the Kedusha, the holiness, never left. How would Reb Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer argues that according to the Raavad, you can also bring the sacrifices at Temple Mount? According to him, there's another concept, not according to him, there's another concept called the Bamot, the private altars. That literally means the high places that existed before the time of the temple, mainly during the tabernacle time, which that was the historic era before there was the established temple in Jerusalem by King Solomon being built. By King Solomon, there was the tabernacle, which was a mobile temple, was a giant tent. During that time, there were some areas of that time where private altars were allowed in the Jewish nation. So Jews were able to bring private sacrifices in their backyard or in public altars that are outside Jerusalem. And again, it was in very specific times that there was such heter, such exception. Now, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer makes the argument that since the Raavad holds that the Kedusha, the sanctification, did not remain in the Holy Temple, then, according to him, we can return to the private altars, to the Bamot, and we can make one private altar in Temple Mount. So it will have there an altar not from the status of the original altar of Beit HaMikdash, rather from the status, from the validity of a private altar of the Bama. So again, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer makes an argument, sure, we should return to the sacrifices, either because we hold like the Rambam that the sanctification always remained, or like we hold like the Raavad that the sanctification expired, but that also means that now one is allowed to bring the Bamot, the private altars. Now, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer makes the argument that we're not sure if we can bring it, throughout the whole of Israel to create private altars, but sure we can create one in Temple Mount itself. So again, this is how Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer explains the idea of how we can return back to the land and bring sacrifices today, even without a temple. And indeed, as he makes the argument that every day in the prayer, we ask God to go back and bring the sacrifices. And indeed, we're commanded in many commandments to bring various offerings. If it's the daily offering, the guilt offering, the festive offering, the Thanksgiving offering, there are many offerings out there, and we're commanded to bring them. So, considering that, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer says we surely need to go ahead and do that. Return back to Jerusalem and resume the service of the sacrifices. Now, one more point I want to bring to go a little bit backwards and explain. When the Torah commands us about the sacrifices in various verses, in many of them, God says, and you're going to bring this and this sacrifice where? In the place that I shall choose, which is, of course, the temple in Jerusalem. Now, until that time happened, that Jews established the temple during the times of King David and then King Solomon. So again, there was this temporary place, and the sacrifices happened there. Once the place that I will choose was revealed to us through King David and through King Solomon, and the temple was built and sanctified, was mitkadesh, so then that becomes the exclusive place of where we can bring the sacrifices. So now we understand more the arguments here is that according to Maimonides, the place that I shall choose and the holiness and that validity that came through King Solomon, and he was the king, and with his high priest and the Sanhedrin of his time, that is everlasting. And according to the Raavad, the place that I should choose, meaning the validity of that kedusha that bring the halachot, the laws that we discuss, that expires for the time being. But again, per that, Rabbi Tzvi Kalischer makes the points. If that's the case, then we can return to the private altars to bring the sacrifices. Now, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer does not go so far to say that according to the Raavad, we can create private altars everywhere in the land of Israel, but he said for sure you should do it at Temple Mount. So again, this is the argument of Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer, that we need to return to the Avodat HaKorbanot, either because of the validity of the original altar and the original temple never expired, or out of the validity of Bamot, private altars, we should go and do it. In next video, we will discuss the various halachic issues that it comes with. For example, only a priest can do it. So who is considered a priest today? Kohen Meyuchas, some people have a tradition that they're priests, but they're not 100% sure. Also, we will discuss how we're going to deal with impurity, with tumah. Also, we'll discuss how we deal with the bigdei keuna, the priestly garments, which is obligated when the priest brings the korban. So we're going to discuss the various halachic issues that Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Kalischer discusses. But for today, we just discussed the very principal idea of returning back to the land of Israel and resuming the Avodat HaKorbanot. Thank you for joining.